Good afternoon and welcome to the Takeup. Today we have episode 86, Essential Elements of Embroidery and Digitizing. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Takeup. Happy Friday. Happy to have you in and watching and participating in this back to basics kind of episode where we're going to talk about what people need to know to get themselves into successful situations with early embroidery and digitizing. And also for anybody who's been around for a while but is trying to rehab your results, who is maybe coming back to digitizing from not having digitized for a while. Maybe you're working on something and finding yourselves frustrated and wondering, where have I gone wrong? What can I do to make the best of my situation? Well, any of you who are in that kind of ballpark where you're feeling, I need to get back on the basics, I need to get back to what I need to know, or maybe you're thinking about digitizing, doing some of that work yourself, design construction, trying to get your embroidery better and don't know what you don't know. That is one of the problems people have. I've been talking to a lot of new digitizers in this last week. Lots of people looking for those benefits, looking for those basics, looking for that first hit the ground running kind of experience that they need to do their best work. And in that case, I decided I was going to go ahead and grab some of this information, the stuff that I've taught before. However, get back to it, try and formulate it, show you what I think the most essential kinds of knowledge are that you need to pick up in order to digitize successfully, in order to embroider successfully, talk a little bit about how I feel about the different kinds of embroidery knowledge you need to make these things happen, and then discuss a little bit about how we get those kinds of knowledge, how we experience that stuff, and how we make our work better. So in essence, like I said, we're going to jump in. I'm not going to be able to get you from zero to digitizing today. That is not the goal. The goal here today is try to explain the kind of things you need to do and need to know to get that best result, to get yourself on your feet in embroidery digitizing, in embroidery in general to some degree, and how we can use those things to build on and do better and do more. I think by all means, if you're trying to go beyond the basics in embroidery, if you're trying to learn how to construct designs, if you're trying to do something more than just run the basics, do the kind of most obvious elements, the way we handle that is by learning the fundamentals in the best way we can. If we can understand the basic elements of embroidery, if we know how one stitch operates and how stitches operate in contingency with each other, in combination with each other, if we know how stitch types operate and operate in conjunction with each other, if we know how things come together as far as stabilizer, material, needle, file, and machine operation, if we know all these things, if we know those elements, we can stretch beyond, we can start to make alterations that are meaningful. We can start to also diagnose problems as they happen in our design. So this may be a back to basics episode. By all means, I want to hear your questions. I want to see what you guys are thinking and what you find are the stumbling blocks in getting your digitizing off the ground, getting your embroidery off the ground. And we may even go into the comments and do some discussion there too, because I know this is some stuff I've covered before, but I really feel like there is something sometimes lacking in this concept of where people come into, especially digitizing, where they often overestimate the importance of what I call software knowledge, something we're going to talk about in a moment, operation knowledge in software. They worry too much about that without worrying enough about the nature of embroidery, which I think is the more important thing. In any case, I would like to say hi to some of the folks who are showing up live. If you don't know the show, hey, if you don't like the live interaction, jump in a little later when we get to the topic. But I love to say hi to the people who are here. The community is what makes this thing happen. And I really would love to see your comments, your questions, and your stumbling blocks as we go along. So please comment, whether you're on Facebook or YouTube. I should be able to see your comments. Looks like I've got you folks in. And I would absolutely love to answer some of your questions, to address some problems you have if we have time. All right. So with that, by all means, also, there are going to be some things I refer to, some articles. Those are going to be in the links list. The link is the first comment under whatever video you are currently watching. So if you want to see some reading, if you're the kind of person who does well with articles rather than videos as well, or that is good supplemental work for you, jump into the links list. We may discuss what's on there in a little bit. But let's go ahead and say hi to some folks. First, Frank Dunn in the UK. Thank you very much for sharing. Frank, you are an awesome member of the community, and I really appreciate all the work you put in to get good information out there, and hopefully I'm giving some good information too. Gail from Kingsbury Crafts is in. Gail, hopefully I got that right. Hello again. Happy to see you after obviously getting to see you on earlier live shows I've done today. If you haven't seen before, on my YouTube channel, you'll find the half that I do with Aaron Montgomery, and also not on my YouTube channel, but you'll find in my playlist generally, Two Regular Guys podcast, and I help to host that. There are awards going on right now called the Reggies. So the number 2, regularguys.com/Reggies, and they're awards for the embroidery and decoration industry. If you want to nominate people for awards, you have to have a favorite educator, a favorite new thing that came out as far as tools, equipment, and materials. There's all kinds of cool categories for you to nominate, especially if you're in the commercial sphere. But yeah, Cindy King coming in from Texas. Good Friday afternoon. Happy to see you here, Sydney. Aaron is in. Hello. Lori says hello. Hello, Lori. Gary's coming in from North Texas. Beautiful day there, Gary. Happy to hear that, and hope you have a wonderful day out in Texas. Lyndon is joining in from North Carolina. Hi, Lyndon. Jenny is in also from the UK. Good evening. Sally coming in from Norfolk. Happy to have you in too, Sally. Just is coming in from Sweden. Hi. Happy to have you in, and hope you are having a wonderful day where you are. Afternoon from Wendy. Justin Armenta, the digitizer himself and of Embroidery Nerd, as well as digitizing.com. He is in. Happy Friday to you, sir. Candace is coming in saying good afternoon. And also Deborah is in from Ohio, watching from Facebook. Hi, Deborah. Happy to have you in as well. Like I said, I love to interact with the folks in the comments. If you have comments, questions, things you want to point out, hey, things that you think I should mention that are good for other digitizers and embroiderers, by all means, jump in the comments. Like I said earlier, we do have the links list available. We're going to talk about that as well. Certainly, one of the big things we have on that links list are some of the articles. And one of the ones that I'm going to refer to quite a bit is actually one from, it's an older article, but some of these articles are evergreen. Some of this information doesn't change, or at least it doesn't change enough to negate what we've said before. And one of the ones that I'd really love to bring up is actually 3 Steps to Proficient Digitizing. It is over on the Ghost in the Embroidery Machine segment on the Mr. X Stitch blog. You'll have to forgive, there's a couple ads and stuff that might play on the sides, but you can go and check this out on your own from the links list. But we are going to talk about some of the terms and topics that are in this article in particular, because it actually is a pretty good rundown. So if you want to review this again later, the stuff we're going to talk about as far as the 3 kinds of embroidery knowledge, the 6 places you can get this information and knowledge, and what we need to learn, we're certainly going to cover some of these topics here, but this is a great one to read after the fact. So that is definitely on the links list. You'll find that right at the top, as well as some other pieces. We have Essential Guide to a Starting an Embroidery Business from Images Magazine. And this one talks about operations and basic skills. So when I talk about operational knowledge, it's something we're going to discuss as we get into this. This will show you some of the essential guide information for what you absolutely need to know, as far as certainly things like support and repair and things for your business, but also basic skills for embroidery. And like I said, these are basic skills for embroidery operation that everybody should have. And I think when we're talking about operations, I'm not going to go super deep into these, but this does let you know, hey, what should you expect to know before you really even get started with embroidery? These are some of these basic skills. Because when I say operations, certainly we have to know some of the more technical nature of embroidery, things like what stabilizers do we need for what kinds of projects, what kinds of things change in an embroidery design when we use different materials. Those things are definitely there. But lots of folks come into this absolutely brand new. If you've never run an embroidery machine before and you jump right into the stage of saying, I want to create everything from the digitizing all the way down to the final piece, by all means, a lot of this is going to start with your ability to honestly embroider anything. And you should start with somebody else's design first, from a known good supplier, so that you know that you're not working against your own design, or you're not working against truthfully. When you're brand new, you're ignorant to a lot of stuff that might happen on the machine. Good to know how to operate the machines first. So like I said, basic skills are in that piece. And so I decided to bring those in. It's a nice bullet point list to help you understand what you should know about running a machine, and honestly about the maintenance of an embroidery machine itself. The one thing I always tell people, and when it comes to purchasing equipment as well as anything else, is that if you're brand new to this, or any decoration method whatsoever, one of the things you have to watch out for is people want to buy higher end but used hardware from people, sometimes very old embroidery machines when they're buying commercial. And you may not know, if you're just starting out in digitizing and embroidering, you might not know if something is related to conditions that are not good on the machine. versus what you're doing in your file versus what you're doing in your execution. And by execution, I mean how you're hooping how you're hooping the file, how you're running the design, the speeds you're running at, the tensions on the machine, the cleanliness of your thread path, your bobbin tensions, as well as top tensions, what have you. If you have all these things going on and some of the flaws are due to the fact that the machine is not in good condition and you're brand new, you might find yourself really frustrated over something that you think is related to digitizing, that you think is related to some other portion of it, but is not. So certainly, I always say when we're talking about the very basics of this thing, one of the things you must do is certainly understand operations and have basic skills. So if you can't load your bobbin correctly yet, start there. Run designs first, start there. Even if you're determined to do digitizing, awesome, but you're going to need some machine time for sure to get things done the best. And I feel like you do, Cindy. That's kind of how I started. She says, I have the running machine down 20 plus years now to get the digitizing down. You are in really good stead. It's what I keep telling everybody when they ask me, like, who makes the best digitizers? Admittedly, graphic artists are great for having the ability to do creative work and interpretation. And I love working with graphic artists. I have helped many people who start from the graphic side, from the creative side, kind of get their hands on the material side of embroidery, because we can't divorce ourselves from the fact that we're running equipment, that the equipment has its own needs and wants and things that it can and can't do, and that it relates to a very fuzzy kind of world. I mean, fuzzy in the fact that it's not clean and calculating as to how the interaction of needle, thread, stabilizer, and fabric come together. I've helped artists get there, but what I'm going to tell you is, if I have somebody who's really solid on embroidery and they know how embroidery works, they're going to understand why I want to do what I want to do with stitches, and why we need to set settings or variables in a certain way, why you need underlay of a certain kind, why you need to work with pull and push compensation because of distortion on the machine. They are going to know that first, and they won't have the first problem people usually have. Like I said, that you get obsessed with software, and that is that we consider the file itself to be our product, not the embroidery, and people get hung up on the way the file looks in software and end up making a lot of mistakes, not dealing with distortion correctly, because it looks right on the software. The two lines line right up on the design on screen. Why is it not happening on the machine? That, because you have done embroidery first, you know that the design that you put in that machine, the way it looks in a preview on the screen, is never what we're going to get on the other side. And divorcing those two things and understanding that there's a distortion that always happens is one of the first steps for anybody who comes from a world of like digital art. So yeah, I agree with you, Cindy. If you've got that 20 plus years of running machine down, you've got a much better chance of getting out of your head the bad assumption that making something on screen is what's going to happen when we get to the machine. And honestly, it's what I would tell everybody. The screen is lying to you. It does not want you to succeed. It wants you to fail. Don't trust it. It wants you to make something wrong and chew up designs. Now, that is the funny way of just saying, no matter what kind of software you're using, it does not matter whatsoever. If something looks perfect on screen and absolutely the correct scale, and all of the satin stitches are exactly the thickness that you want them, and all of your circles are perfectly circular and everything is exactly aligned, when it gets to the machine, it will look like junk, because all of the natural distortion that is in embroidery that cannot be eliminated, or at least not entirely, all that distortion, especially if we don't mitigate it through compensation and through the way that we create our not only our designs, but put together our materials, that distortion is definitely going to happen. So if it's perfect on screen, looks trash on the machine. That's just one of the things you're going to find out. But all right, Tom's also in. Say hi to Tom while he's here. Tom of Buzzards Bay, and of consulting himself now, actually, lately of Buzzards Bay, but now doing his own consulting. Tom, happy to have you in. Great at digitizing and doing crazy great embroidery. And Mike Downey, reciprocator #1. Glad to see you here too. All right, so with that, we showed you the stuff on the links list really quickly, that we do have that links list there for you. Go check that out. If you haven't checked it out, you can go ahead and grab all these articles. Last few things I'll show you as far as what is on the list and what you might want to check out later. We do have discussions of distortion. I know these are articles that I've referred to many times. I'll also say, funny enough, I had somebody come and find me because they were worried somebody had stolen something from me. Some videos have been using some of these images when they discuss it. Hey, that is what we do. We teach. So I'm glad that people are teaching distortion. And there's push and pull. Both of those are listed here. And so we're going to talk about compensation, distortion, and those. I also have a Digitizing 101 article from Printware that's listed on there, and that really talks about the different stitch types and what those stitch types are and how they operate, what they're used for. Because like I said, we're going to talk about some essentials today, but we aren't going to be able to talk about everything that I need to teach you for digitizing. First, we're going to talk about what we need to know and how and what it is that we don't know that we don't know. We'll start from that. Underlay is also going to be a big thing we talk about briefly. But in this case, I've got a piece from Mr. X Stitch here called Underlay What Lies Beneath that goes over some basic discussion of what underlay is and tries to get you to think about building underlay and building up stitches from the garment up as a kind of an architectural, a structural, functional object. So underlay isn't just stitching that goes under the top, even though that's part of what it is. It talks about what it does and why. We also have an additional guide to underlay stitching here from Graphics Pro from an article I wrote for them. So those things are all in the links list. We'll definitely cover some of it, but each one of these topics, you'll find videos on this channel, you'll find articles that I've written, and you'll find things in the links list that can be helpful for you. But let's go ahead and actually get into the comment itself. So we have a couple things that I think are very interesting in that links list. So hopefully you'll go ahead and check that out. But most definitely, if nothing else, I would look at that 3 steps to proficient digitizing. And like I said, we'll be bringing that up on screen several times as we go through here. That Mr. X article gives you the best rundown of the kind of knowledge you need and how to get it. And that's something that we'll be talking about here today for sure. So let's go ahead and get into the actual meat of this thing, right? We have our links, we know what's going on, but the first thing I'm going to do is actually bring up one of my favorite terms that everybody kind of gives me trouble about. This is the drinking game you can play with me when I teach you digitizing your embroidery. How many times has Eric today said the word holistic? I would say, unless you really hate your liver in your life, don't play the drinking game where you drink every time I say holistic. It's certainly not a good bet, because I will absolutely destroy you. Holistic is one of the terms I use all the time. What does this mean? In this case, I'm not just saying dictionary definition. I'm just going to kind of give you the sense of it. As far as embroidery goes, as far as digitizing goes, when I say we have to have a holistic understanding of embroidery or of digitizing, what am I talking about? I'm saying that there are multiple things that all go into the success of your embroidery. There are lots of inputs that end up being a determiner of whether you're going to have a successful piece of embroidery that not only runs correctly on the machine or looks good, not only looks good, because everybody worries about the look, but also runs correctly on the machine, doesn't break thread, doesn't distort, doesn't chew up garments, isn't too heavy, doesn't feel good on the person, what have you, the qualities that we're looking for in successful embroidery. These things come from a holistic understanding. In order to make sure we get what we need and we know what we need to make the best embroidery, we have to understand at least, like I said, what I consider the 3 types of embroidery knowledge. But in general, it just means this: you cannot be ideal at embroidery and digitizing, and especially we're talking about digitizing, which is really the focus here, without understanding how machines operate, without understanding that different fabrics react differently to being embroidered, that different stabilizers exist, and these stabilizers can change how stable and how resistant to movement, puckering, and distortion your garment is, that hooping and the tension on your hoop changes how stable the garment is in the hoop, and that the different kinds of hoops and clamps operate differently. Without understanding that what tension on your thread does, both top tension and bottom tension, and without understanding what the different stitch types do in concert with each other. So what does this mean? Well, what it means is that a holistic view takes all of this into account. If you're somebody who's coming from the art side and you think you're just going to digitize, but you're never going to touch needles and thread, and you don't ever want to watch a machine run, you're cutting off a third of what you need to know at least. And I would say it's more like a half. You are cutting off a massive amount of material knowledge. If you don't know how thread behaves on the machine, if you don't know what different needles do to a garment, if you don't know what stabilizer does in as far as arresting movement, supporting stitches, and supporting a garment, you won't really be able to digitize in a way that is supportive to these needs, or that deals with things like material texture, material stretch, grain, the ability then to create coverage and to have a nice hand, a nice flexible hand, and not just jam a bunch of density in, is going to be hard for you to maintain, because you're not going to think about that. And this also includes some art stuff that people don't always like thinking about, but like color combinations. If you don't think about the fact that color contrast changes how coverage works, you're probably not going to be able to make the most use of density, like lighter densities that you could have. So if we want excellent embroidery, the best embroidery possible, then it only comes from a holistic knowledge of embroidery. We must know materials, we must know thread, we must know our machines very well. And then we should also, of course, know theoretical things about embroidery and digitizing and stitch types, and we should know our software very well. Most people get hung up on understanding how to push the buttons. Pushing the buttons is awesome, but if you don't know why you want a stitch or how a stitch is going to act when it is stitched on a garment or on a specific garment, if you don't know the how of how that's going to work, if you don't know why you want the stitch, if you're just trying to get thread somewhere, you're not going to make the best embroidery and you're probably not going to make the best choices. This comes from this holistic understanding. So when I say the word holistic, that's what I mean. If you don't know how embroidery is going to operate in a machine, the likelihood is no matter how great you feel like you are in digitizing interpretation, you will always have kind of a leg missing on your table, shall we say. You won't have all of the understanding you need to make things happen. And honestly, this doesn't end when you get good at digitizing. It doesn't end at any part in your career. If someone comes out with a brand new material you've never seen before, suddenly somebody is out there, using some sort of brand new printing process to create deposited materials. And now we're going to embroider this new fabric that comes out of a process we've never seen before. That means somebody like me, even with years and years of experience, when that new material comes in the door, I'm going to have to embroider that with some of the standard stitch types I use and use different materials for stabilizers, use different needles, change the speeds on the machine and see how this stuff behaves when I apply embroidery to it to understand how it works. And because I will have an elemental knowledge of what all of these the threads and materials and stitch types do on the different materials that I'm trying to use these on, I will then be able to use that information to change how I digitize and how I design, to change how I operate, to change what materials I put together to make things work. That is just the way it is. I'm not going to say that you can't get there from any different vector. You can start as, and not vector is vector drawing, but hey, that's part of it. You can start as an embroiderer and work your way into the digitizing side, and then maybe you'll pick up some artistic stuff so you get a better aesthetic look. You can get different effects down the road, but you can start from embroidery. You can start from art and come into it and then get into the medium. But it's the same thing as if you're working with any different media. If you're a digital artist and then picked up oil paint, getting the right color is going to take you time, and vice versa. And the same thing here. Embroidery is a medium that is physical, that has its own nature you're going to have to work around and work with. And if you don't know what embroidery is in any one of these places, or hey, if you come from sewing and embroidery and hand embroidery, and you know thread and you know material very well, but you don't know anything about software or drawing or layering or outputting files, or the way that the machine operates and the way it trims and the way it jumps and the other things that it needs to do, you still will be missing a leg. You know what I mean? You'll be missing a leg on your table that's holding up this whole thing. So the holistic way is to get all those legs under your table, to get the legs under your stool so you don't tip over. It's just one of those things. So that's oh, I love this, by the way. Yeah, Jeff says, if you leave holistic up on the screen as a banner, does that mean we don't stop drinking? Like I said, don't do that. Don't do that. I mean, you might have been mildly late, but you will actually be the late Jeff Fuller if you drink every time I say holistic. Don't do that. No drinking games. It's a bad plan. And good afternoon, Baby Jean. Happy to have you in. All right, the next thing I'm going to talk about here, guys, the 3 types of knowledge. This is one of the basic things that I bring to just about every discussion of digitizing. If you're coming into digitizing or embroidery from anywhere, and especially, like I said, even if you're coming in and you're not intending to digitize, I think that all of us should know the terminology of digitizing and definitely the theory of embroidery. We have to know things like stitch types and underlay and how these operate, even if we won't be doing our own creations, because we really won't be able to even ask people for what we want and what we need if they are doing the work for us, unless we understand the terminology involved. If I don't know a satin stitch from a fill, I can't ask a digitizer to change to a different stitch type. I mean, that's the most basic version of this, but it absolutely helps me to be able to communicate, even if I'm someone who's never going to digitize myself. However, primarily talking about digitizers, or at least people who have digitizing aspirations, I think there are 3 types of knowledge that we absolutely have to have in order to make this thing happen and get a chance at being the best we can to have successful outcomes. And these 3 types of knowledge start thus. I would call the first type, if I want to just classify it, I'm going to call this execution, right? Execution. And this means the stuff that we do on the machine side. We're not digitizing yet. We're not talking about theory. We're not interpreting art. This is execution. Someone else has provided the file for us, and we need to make that into an embroidered piece. Technically, I would usually consider this materials and equipment. If we go ahead and pull up that piece from Mr. X Stitch, you'll see that that's what we're classifying that as. But materials and equipment, understanding materials and equipment is really the immediate base. Like I said, if you can't produce, and pardon me with the little ads and stuff that are playing here, if you can't produce embroidery from someone else's file with the equipment that you have, the chances of you digitizing well or being able to isolate what you are trying to do when you're digitizing and making any sense of the results that you get so you can make alterations to your file are nil. In order to digitize, especially if you're testing your stuff and you're on the machine you're going to run yourself and you don't really know it, you need to know that machine inside and out. And honestly, if we remember what digitizing is, we are controlling through a pre-programmed script a machine. That is what we're doing. Our friendly embroidery robot is going to look at the instructions we give it, and it's going to move its pentagram around, and it's going to lift the needle when we tell it and drop the needle when we tell it, and it's going to run at the speeds we tell it, and it's going to engage its trimmers and all the other things that we tell it to do according to the commands that we've given it in the file. We are remotely controlling a robot, or we are programming a robot with a preset script of things we want it to do. With that understanding, we have to know how the robot works. If we don't know how fast it can move reasonably, if we don't know what's going to happen when we give it a command, if we don't know how it operates in general, the likelihood of us being good at controlling the robot with our file is very low. So I know that's a different way of thinking about it. I like it because the reason I called this whole column that I have over there at Mr. X Stitch, which I need to start back in on. The reason I called it Ghost in the Embroidery Machine is that I always consider digitizers being like that. It is like I am sending myself to your machine to control it remotely. I am the ghost in the machine controlling it, making the design if you use one of my designs. But the thing is, I have to understand how that machine moves and the things that it needs and does well and doesn't do well if I want it to work. And especially if I'm testing a machine myself, if I'm working on my design myself, which is, I think, the best kind of knowledge you can ever get as a digitizer, is actually operating the machine yourself, running the design on the garment or material style that you intend the design to go on. It's the best kind of knowledge, the best kind of feedback you can ever get for digitizing. You have to then know how it works. So this is the basic understanding that I've placed in this article, and I think it's a good list to go from. So you should understand how embroidery machines work on a basic level and what functions they are capable of. Number one, I'm just going to say, anytime we talk about stitch types, realize that the only stitch that an embroidery machine can actually make, a conventional embroidery machine, is one line of thread, a single line of thread that is one thickness of thread wide from one point to another. Everything else we do is by stacking those stitches together in a particular order and in a particular configuration. It only makes one stitch. It doesn't work underneath the piece. It only works on the top. We can only trim and jump and move to another area if we want a gap. We can't tie knots. So really everything we do is made by stacking individual lines of a particular thickness together. That's it. Everything you've ever made in embroidery is made out of one stitch, stacked together, put in different configurations. Once we understand that, we can say, what are the basic things we can do? Well, we can make a stitch and we can stack them closer together, further apart. We can make the stitches longer or shorter, and we can change their angles. That's it. Once we break it down to those elements, though, we can start to see how stacking them together becomes at least more understandable once we go into that place. But the thing is, we have to understand that's what our machines do. We should know how thread behaves as it's stitched and how specific threads, needles, and fabrics react when used with each other. If you're having problems with quality and looping, but you don't understand that your needle eye isn't big enough for the kind of thread you're passing through it, if we don't know that the thickness of the thread makes difference to what densities we need in our digitizing portion, certainly, but also that it changes things about our friction and the loop creation that we can have, we're going to have problems. We need to understand how threads act and how they react. And also that there may be issues with needing more pull compensation. If a thread has a tendency to pull more, or has a tendency to lash or spring back or cause ripples, we need to know this stuff. We need to know about how our thread operates. You should understand how materials hold up to the stresses of embroidery and how stabilizers keep material solid as it runs. This is why I call them stabilizers and not backing, because they're meant to keep things dimensionally stable. We're trying to arrest stretch in any one given direction, because if we have a stabilizer, a material we stick on the back that allows it to stretch in one angle, we're going to end up where we get any sort of stitch that lines up in the angle. We know the stitches get shorter, they pull in, they get tighter. Well, if we hit the angle that that stabilizer doesn't cover and we pull in, it's going to get smaller. That stitch is going to shrink more, bundle up the material inside of the stitch more than if it were at a different angle. This is something we'll talk about when we're talking about the embroidery theory portion of this. But we should understand that if we have some materials that are, they have a texture in one direction, they have a grain, if they have a certain direction in which they stretch more, we're going to have to know that our material that we use to stabilize it has to be able to arrest the stretch in that direction, because we want to make sure that pretty much any direction stitches are being placed, they're not going to stretch more than any other, because that's a hard distortion to deal with. Otherwise, we'd be trying to fight that in our file. Mostly, we don't want that. We want stable material that's not going to visibly stretch in any one given direction any more than another, and that is, as much as we can get it without using too much stabilizer, is going to stay stable and not compress, not stretch, not ripple, as much as we can deal. Like I said, we don't want too much stabilizer because that makes the garment not fun to wear. It really makes the hand of the garment worse. It makes it not flexible, not feel good. But we should understand how the materials hold up to stresses of embroidery for sure, and how the stabilizers work with that. We should know those combinations. You have to learn how thread tension affects a design and how to maintain the balance between bobbin and top thread tensions. That is just basic stuff. I can't tell you how many times somebody says they're having issues with something about their digitizing, and I actually find out they just got a dirty bobbin case and they've got issues with bobbin thread coming up to the top, and they keep saying, hey, I'm digitizing this wrong, something is going on with it. And you're like, we can't change tension with our digitized files. Tension's happening on the machine. You have to know how it operates and have your tension set and balanced. And you should know how tight a garment should be hooped. Overly tight hooping, especially on something that stretches, if you stretch it to its absolute nth degree and then smash down a hoop on this thing, then the stretch material is going to rebound when you let it go. That's going to cause rippling and problems, especially because you're going to stitch down an area that stays stretched underneath your design. We're stitching it to that stabilizer that doesn't stretch. And then when it all rebounds, we're going to have wrinkles and crud all around the design. You need to stop that distortion by not overly stretching. But then if you have a really loose hoop, the material is just going to move all around anyway, and it's not going to arrest any of the motion. So we should understand how our hoops are involved in that as well. And this includes issues with like floating versus hooping. You guys know I'm a hoop person. I think hoops are there for a reason, to hold that material down. Unless something's going to be crushed by the hoop or damaged, I tend to be a person who hoops. The truth of the matter is, what we're really looking for is stable material. So however you get there, we want stable material that once we're done stitching, like I said, doesn't have too much stabilizer behind it, so it doesn't feel bad. So we have to understand this stuff. And also, certainly part of the equipment stuff, you need to know how to run your equipment. I mean, you need to know how to keep your equipment maintained, and you have to understand if it is maintained correctly and what's going on with it. If we're having issues that are not embroidery issues, or not digitizing issues, they are embroidery issues, they are machine execution issues, you have to be able to know that instead of saying that it's digitizing or thinking that it's digitizing. So keeping your machine clean, keeping it oiled on schedule, and making sure that you know how to run it and how to do the execution half of embroidery, or that portion of embroidery, is going to make you much more likely to be successful at digitizing, because we can eliminate all this stuff. We can say, all right, it's not a pull compensation issue. I don't need to add pull compensation or change the shapes that I'm drawing if it's a stabilizer issue, if it's a machine issue, if I literally have a damaged machine where the x-axis isn't working correctly and so I'm losing width on the design. I mean, these things can happen. It's rare, certainly. But like I said, there's some people who will come to me and they're like, I've bought this old equipment. It doesn't work very well. One of the machines does this. The other machine does this on the same file. And I start to talk through it with them, and you may find out there's equipment problems, or you find out that they're having execution problems, or they don't really understand their materials. You have to know this stuff. Also, like I said, things like material interactions. If you're running a jersey knit or something ribbed and you have a satin stitch with a vertical angle or a fill stitch with a vertical angle, you're going to have to do some work to keep it from falling into those ribs and causing rippling and show through and other issues, because the grain of the material and the structure of the material will change how that stitching turns out. They interact, because we always think of a surface that we're putting something on top of, like printing, but we're not. We have material that we're jamming thread through. We have this plane. Imagine us walking on the garment and we're jamming this material through it. And the texture and the hills and valleys and the amount of stretch affects how that embroidery is going to turn out. If we don't understand that, we're going to be confused by the results that we get with our digitizing. We won't know why shapes are changing. We won't know why things are showing through on some materials and not on others, or why certain parts of our design that have vertical stitch angles or something close to vertical look different than the ones that have a horizontal stitch angle or a 45-degree stitch angle. All of these angles can affect the way that the fabric behaves, and different fabrics can behave differently under tension, under stress, when embroidered. It's not that you're going to know all of this stuff, Pat. You're not going to be a material scientist. That's not what I'm saying. But if you don't know some of the common materials and how they operate, and if you haven't watched an embroidery machine do what it does and watch the distortion happen, if you haven't compared a design to an actual embroidered piece and seen how it changes, you're probably not going to have a great time understanding what's going on with your embroidery. It's just how it is. And so that's one of those things. I think it's worth doing. It's worth looking at. It's worth understanding. And I will say, when I'm dealing with folks who come from the art side and who just want an embroidered result, there are times where I stop and tell them, hey, if all you want is the embroidered objects and you don't want to learn the medium of embroidery, you're probably better off buying embroidered objects from someone who wants to make them. If you want to learn the medium, then digitizing is something worthwhile. If you have good reasons for your business to take it on, you want to do creative work that's different, you want to have that control for yourself, you want to do something that's fast turnarounds, you have certain things you have to keep in-house or be able to do quickly or locally, there are good reasons to digitize in-house. There are also good reasons to embroider yourself if you want control over that quality, if you want to use non-standard materials, if you don't want to order things out from somewhere else, if you have a locality that's hard to get to and you want to stock garments and make sure that people can run those, you want to add embroidery to specific items that are not commonly offered by other embroiderers. Those are great reasons. If you're someone who's tuning in for this and all you really want are embroidered hats and you don't really want to learn how to run machines, you don't want to learn about embroidery, I don't think that's anybody here, especially if you sat through this much of this. However, if you know somebody who does, then the chances are they should be hiring an embroiderer, not buying a machine. Because part of what we have to do if we're going to get good at this is understand these things, at least to some level. At the very, very least, we will have to run the kind of garments we believe will be in our product mix with some files and understand how those garments and those materials that we intend to use operate and how they behave under tension, with needles going through them, with thread involved, with the kinds of designs we think we're going to run. So that's the materials and equipment section. And these are the questions you're really asking. How do I prepare to stitch and run machines correctly? You have to answer that question for yourself. And how do materials behave when embroidered? Those are the two things you need to know. If you don't know these things, the chances are you're going to have a hard time with this leg of our stool, as it was, this leg of our table. So with that, let's jump into the comments for just a second while we're in between these sections. And so we all saw Jeff was suggesting maybe we keep drinking if the title is up. Mike says if embroidery in general hasn't already driven one to drink, and holistic is the word that finally pushes them over the edge, they are a stronger breed than I. Yeah, I have to say, if you have never wanted to tipple after a day of working on embroidery, and especially if you are early in your digitizing career and you haven't been frustrated, you're probably not stretching your your skills very much. I have absolutely ruined garments. If you feel bad about ruining a garment, but I will absolutely absolve you. I will be the patron saint of lost digitizers and embroiderers. I've ruined more garments than you, I promise, especially if you're young in this. I've got 20 years of wrecking garments. Don't worry about it at all. I forgive you if you need it. And you can tell everybody that I said it was an essential part of the process because it bloody well is. All right. It absolutely is essential to the process to work on garments and to push them to the limit and see what they do. I think it's essential. And honestly, I think that embroidery experience, getting on a machine, is probably the most essential part of digitizing education. And people always kind of get shocked at that. They're like, really? Not learning settings, not learning everything else? Yes. We absolutely must know density, underlay, stitch types. We have to know these things. We have to know pull compensation, push compensation, and distortion. We have to know these things. Absolutely. We have to know these things. However, if we never put them into practice, if they never get to the needle and thread, if they never get to the garment, they're not real. They don't actually show us what's going to happen. The produce of digitizing is embroidery. The produce of digitizing isn't the file. Nothing matters until the stitches happen. That's the meme joke that I throw out at people all the time, especially when you see digitizers come up with all digital previews who won't show you any of their files. Stitches or it didn't happen. That's it. If you don't see it in stitches, it doesn't exist. It's not real yet. It's real when you stitch it. And the folks who are in the comments who I know better, you guys know you've ruined garments, you've tested things, you've done 10 runs on one thing to try and figure out a technique. Absolutely. So one more thing we got David saying hi. Hi, David. And Mike saying, remember the last garment you ruined? Yeah, it wasn't the last one. If you are breathing and you are going to do more embroidery, you're going to ruin another garment. That's okay. That's okay, folks. That's how it is. That's how it is. And yeah, I know Jeff's saying it, and I'll say it too. Machine's too expensive. Give me something in the inbox. I'll digitize it. I understand that machines are expensive. I will say this. If you really want to be a good digitizer, you don't have to own your machine. You do have to run one. If you go to some other shop to run it, if you have someone else run it for you and you measure it, that's partially okay. I really think where the rubber meets the road is watching like a hawk while your design runs. You don't have to do it for every element of every design. If you are trying to learn, if you are trying to develop a new technique, if you are working on a piece of material you never worked on before, put down YouTube, put down TikTok, put down anything else that takes your eyes off. You can listen to stuff if you can concentrate and do both. Watch the machine run. Watch it run. Yes, I know. Sometimes on long designs it's painful. I'm not saying you're watching every stitch in a large fill, but watch it run, especially when we are at critical junctures where you don't know how the stitch type is going to work. You're worried about an area. You don't know how that material is going to react to the kind of stitches you have. Watch the design run. Be a watcher. Actually watch it like a hawk. You're going to get more out of this experience than if you just look at the design. Now, I mean, second best, looking at your design and then having someone stitch something out and having them both in front of you and taking measurements and feeling it and understanding all the places where it was too dense or looks weird. But that's one of those things. Watching and, hey, listening, that's the funny thing too. Jeff says, machine says ka-chunk, and everyone runs over to see what's broken. I understand that we're not going to watch every design we ever ran in our entire lives, and we're not going to be paying rapt attention. But when we want to understand what's going on, when we want to develop a technique, when we want to learn, watching is critical to really get the understanding, because you're going to see the stitch gets placed in the material and you're going to see that it narrows. You're going to see how it's pulling on the fibers of the garment. You'll watch. Let's say we have that grain problem where we have something that's ribbed and we got those vertical fills or vertical satins, and we'll start to see that individual satins are pulling down into those valleys, or we're going to see that there's some texture there, or that the ribs of the material are spreading out the top thread. And we're going to start thinking about how we can mitigate these circumstances, how we can put underlay in to get some color coverage over top of that, how we can battle this with maybe we'll have some sort of stabilizing agent on top, some topper, some water soluble stabilizer, something that would hold down some fibers while we're working. We will start to see the materials interact, and material interaction is critical. And also stitch type interaction. We're going to talk about theory next. The way different stitch types interact when they are layered together or put on top of each other, put near each other, how different stitch angles interact when they come together. This is going to be part of how we get our results. If we understand what's going to happen when we run one stitch over another or one stitch next to another, if we understand that on an elemental level, we'll be able to understand it when it's put together in a design in a complex level. That is just how it is. That is just how it is. But let's go ahead and go to the next part of this section. Certainly, I know I'll be going into bonus time probably today, but I will try and keep it relatively in control for you guys. At least this is a good one to listen to. Not everything is fully visual. You can go about your work and keep on podcast style listening. But the next portion of this is theory, right? I'm going to call it theory. If you're looking at this article from Mr. X Stitch, was an earlier article, it is technical knowledge of embroidery and digitizing. But the reason I call it theory here is that this is understanding stitch types, understanding stitches themselves, understanding settings, and not settings, but variables. The reason I make the difference between variables and settings, variables are the things we can change about a given stitch, about a given stitch type, about the way our embroidery is put together. Settings are software-based. Do settings affect our variables? Absolutely, it's what they're usually looking at. If we're talking about these settings that are on a particular stitch or a block of stitches that we have in our digitizing software, certainly those settings are affecting the variables. That is how we control our variables. But the reason I make the difference is you can have variables that aren't set by settings. If I go in and start digitizing something point by point, or if I put a bunch of run stitches together in a certain configuration, the spacing between those rows of run stitches is still density. Why? I'm talking about how dense, how close together, how many stitches are in a given area. that doesn't require it to be a density setting on a stitch. If I put different stitches in different colors that are not in the same block of stitches together in one area, I can still talk about how close together those lines of stitching are as a function of density. That's why it's theory. That's why it is a variable, not necessarily a setting. When we're talking about a block of fill stitches and I want to change that, I'm looking at a setting for density. It tells me how dense that one block of stitching is. When I'm looking at a design and I'm talking about multiple lines of thread, or maybe I'm digitizing some engraving style pieces and I'm looking at how close together these lines of stitching are and how many stitches I have in a given small area, or how close together these lines are, that's still density, and that's a variable. And so that's why I talk about variables versus settings. It doesn't mean that you don't use settings to change variables. What it means is settings belongs in that software category. Right now, we're talking about theory. We're talking about technical knowledge of embroidery and digitizing. And we talk about that here. This is the kind of stuff I'm talking about. Once again, a nice bulleted list. So we'll go down the bulleted list as a starting point from the Mr. X Stitch article. You should know the types of stitches which machine embroidery is capable of creating. So once again, what is that really? One stitch point to point. But we should understand that when we're making any other kind of stitch type, it is a collection of these point to point stitches that are at different they are different densities, they are different closeness to each other, different spacings, and different angles in relation to the previous stitch that was stitched before it. That's really what we're making. We want to understand, though, the functional stitch types. So the top three, of course: fill stitch, or some sort of seating stitch, some sort of filling stitch. Often a tatami is really what people will usually use, tatami style patterned fill. So a broken pattern, so it's not just lining up all of our penetration points. That is one of them. Second being satin stitch, where if we have two lines describing a column, we come across exactly, usually we're coming across perpendicular to each of those lines and then having an angled return stitch. So we have a pass across and then we have an angled return and then another pass across. That's our satin stitch. Long unbroken stitches is why we call it that. Satin, as a weave on a material, also has long unbroken stitches on its face, which is why it's shiny. So we have satin stitch, and then we have straight stitch. Sometimes we'll put straight and manual together. These are stitches in a line. If it is a straight stitch or a running stitch, that means it's generally the same length repeated. Manual stitches, each stitch is not identical. They are individual and can be set to any angle, any particular length that you want, because we're just putting in penetration points. Of course, straight stitches have a setting. They have a variable for length that we're setting in general, though they may do things like automatically shorten into a curve to maintain fidelity to the curve that we're trying to put them around. And of course, because they are straight lines, a stitch is always, always, always a straight line. If you try and curve a running stitch, it has to build that out of small segments of straight lines. And that's why we often curve or shorten our stitch length as we go into these curves. Why? Well, if we're trying to describe a curve with straight lines, well, the tighter that curve is, as we try and get close to that curve, we're going to have to shorten our stitches so that we can approximate that curve with our straight lines. That is what it is. When we look at a curve, what we really have is individually like infinitesimal tiny straight lines all together curving around that side. Well, if we're doing this with stitches, we're going to decide how much of that shortening we want to be able to handle, or the software will decide that for us and get as close as it can to the curve that we describe, right? So those are our three big stitch types. That's one of the things we need to know, is what these stitch types are and what they look like, how they function, what's the best use, certainly. So if we're filling a big, wide, flat area that doesn't have a lot of complex shape to it, a fill stitch is going to be a good choice, mostly. Can we fill that area with something else? Absolutely. That gets into aesthetics. But we know for wider elements, things that are above, say, 10 millimeters in width, we're usually looking at a fill stitch to try and get those filled. Things that are columns that are narrow and tend to be in a columnar rectangular shape, anything less than that 10 mils especially, we're probably looking at a satin stitch to fill that. Depends on our texture that we want, but anything less than that, down to about 1 millimeter, is where we're going to have satin stitches. If we go much less than 1 millimeter, especially with 40 weight thread, we may have issues. So we understand that. And straight stitches for anything narrower than that, and for details that are made up of thin lines. That's what we're usually doing. We understand that. So know the type of stitches that the machine can do and have some idea what are appropriate for a given element and maximum and minimum sizes for any stitch type that you're using. That's stuff we have to know technical knowledge about embroidery. So that's, once again, this is also about embroidery. We're still not into software. This is really about the nature of how an embroidery design is constructed. So we can also kind of call this to some degree design construction. To a degree, that's certainly part of it. You have to know how close to place stitches to get full coverage on the material. That is density, but we're trying to do that without producing undue stress on that material or making the garment overly stiff. So we know how thick our threads are. We know how close together those lines of stitching need to be to get coverage for ourselves, the coverage that we want. Doesn't always have to be complete full coverage, but we're trying to understand what that coverage is and how close together density stitches need to be to get that. We should know how to express measurements used in embroidery. You should understand that an embroidery point is 1/10 of a millimeter. If someone talks about density, density is a measurement of the space between stitches. I know I put this up for you guys a million times, and I know this is something you've seen before, but this is something I can't tell you how many times I come across people not knowing what the density numbers mean and becoming confused with them. Someone has said to them what to set something to, and they follow that setting, but they don't know the why, the wherefore, or what it is. Well, because we're talking about density, what is the measurement of density? It's how many stitches are in a given area, but what does the number describe? The number describes the space between courses of stitching. I'm calling a course one time across the shape and one time back. That's my courses of stitching. And that's why when you want to measure it, and I know you've heard this before if you've been around me for any given period of time, but I'm going to do it anyway because this is something that you can't know enough. If we're measuring density on an existing fill on a design that we're not looking at the settings in our software, we're measuring the design itself. If you measure from one line across a second to the third, that is density in your fills. If your software expresses it in millimeters, here this is usually a pretty standard density for 40 weight thread. That is 0.4 millimeters. That's 4 embroidery points. So if your system, if your software like Stitch Artist expresses it in points, that's going to be 4-point fill. If you have another system that expresses it in millimeters, Wilcon does that famously, 0.4 millimeters, it's the same measurement. It's a measurement of space between courses of stitching. Same thing with the satins. Because you have these chisel edges, it's easy to measure them from the edge, but it's the same thing. From one line across the angled return to the next line, that is our density measurement. That is 0.4 millimeters. We should be able to express that. And like I said, 0.4 millimeters, 4 embroidery points. In this particular case, it's a very kind of common full coverage setting for density for 40 weight thread, but it could be anything. Also, let's say if we have an incredibly widely spaced out, lots of big gaps in it, the measurement of that density is still the same. And frankly, if we're measuring in a design, it doesn't even have to be density. We can talk about this in other ways. Let's say I'm looking at digitizing something and I'm trying to see if the gap between these details is going to be enough for me to see some space between them. I'm going to look and say, can I get that space in there? Well, if I know that 0.4 millimeters between those courses of stitching is going to be a fully covered fill, if I look at this detail around this border, right, I'm drawing a rope here that has these little details and shading. Well, I know that if I've got, this is going to be 2 passes of thread here, 2 passes of thread here. Well, if I measure more than 0.8 mils between those, I know that with 40 weight thread, I'm probably going to have a gap that I can see. So if I measure between those two and I get 0.93 millimeters, the chances are I'm going to see some space between them, because whether you use a fill stitch or you draw the lines yourself, you know that if we have those 3 passes of thread and we have 0.4 millimeters there, that's full coverage. We can understand coverage in our variables. We can understand density without it being a variable, or at least without it being a setting in our system. And it's the same thing here. We've got this detail where it was on the side of a fire engine, and I think it's a little ladder that was here. And these lines, 0.46 mils between them, there is no chance that these lines were going to show the red behind them. These lines, if they were drawn in black thread, are going to completely fill over the side of this truck unless I increase the spacing. So you increase the spacing, you remove some of the lines, and you skip it until you get clear spacing. But why do I know how to do that? Because I understand what density means. I can measure it, and I can express those numbers and know what that means. That is part of that theory crafting, that understanding of theory. You should be able to recognize the roles of underlay and how it combats garment show through. So you guys know I had the guides to underlay that are here. if this is an edge walk plus a double zigzag, or some people will call this particular configuration a German underlay, I should understand that the edge walk underlay supports the edge. I should know that inset is how far it is away from the outside edges, and that what we're doing is we're supporting the edge and creating rails that the embroidery, the top stitching runs on, and then the zigzags also create more of that stability. That's why I always make this little graphic here so you can see. Let's imagine that our garment is a field with a little grass on it. Well, edge run is like putting rails below the planks on our boardwalk, and maybe the zigzag is adding additional coverage so you're not seeing through those planks and supporting it. It is functional. It is physical. We have to understand digitizing embroidery, or to digitize underlay. We have to understand the embroidery side of that in order to understand why we're going to digitize that. And then when we understand what that is and how to express it, then and only then do we really need to worry about our software settings. We know what we want before we ever go to the software and the settings. The tools are there to give us what we want. We should know how those stitches function before we ever have to worry about them in the tools section as far as our basic stitching, for sure. I think that is just a clear thing we should know. So you should know underlay and how it functions. You should know the kinds of distortion that commonly happen during embroidery and how to counteract them to maintain registration. Once again, I know I've shown you guys this a million times, but pull and push compensation in satin stitches, it's really easy to see. Any column of satins that's approaching any kind of coverage density is going to push toward the open ends, and it's going to pull toward the middle of the stitch. It's just how it's going to work. Fills also do this. People say that fills don't, fills do. We're stacking thread together. It's still going to have this work, and individual stitches pull. So fills pull just like the satins do. The reason fills sometimes don't look as, or one of the reasons why fills don't look as pronounced is that every stitch isn't all pulling in one space. Because we have all the edges of these stitches lining up on satins, that column is pulling in one area. When we have fills and the stitches are staggered, they're pulling partially against each other. They're balancing out a little bit more than we would have from satin stitches. Also, satins are often used in small areas. We're often used in small text, things like that. In those, the distortion is more noticeable because the distortion is pretty stable, at least as far as how much distortion is going to happen in a given garment with a given density. And you will find that whether it's large or small, if the letter's large or small, we have a very similar amount of push at the ends and pull on the sides of the column. Depending on how wide those columns are, can change it, of course. But especially like push, when you have very small letters, the amount of distortion you have to put in, the amount of compensation you have to put in for that column to get longer and end up at the same height, for this T to end up at the same height as the E, looks much more drastic. So people are more aware of it with satin stitches, but the truth of the matter is it still happens in all stitches. You're always going to get some distortion. You have to know that stuff in order to counteract it in your design. Other things you have to know: you have to learn the order elements should run in order to make designs logically run. So this is both pathing and layering. This is sequencing as well as pathing. Pathing being where the start points and stop points are and how we travel the apparent motion of the needle through the design. Of course, we know that the garment moves, not the needle, but the apparent motion of the stitches through the design, and how, let's say if we stitch something down and then run stitches up to that thing we've already stitched down, we can cause ripples and fabric issues. We can cause pinching, rippling, and buckling sometimes. So we need to know those orders, as well as being able to hide things under other things as normal or have layering for dimension. And you should know the effect that altering stitch angles has on your design. So how that works on your designs, how to use overlaps. So we know that if we have pull, if we have a satin stitch that's pulling it narrow, we have two satins next to each other and they're on the same angle, well, they're both going to pull apart. If we just have them barely overlapping, the chances are they pull apart and separate. We're going to have to overlap more deeply so that when they pull, they won't separate entirely from each other if we want those to be locked together in the final design. We know the column's going to get narrower. We have to use overlaps to keep from getting gaps. So we should know the effects of these things. We should know proper cornering and joints. So if we're doing mitering, we have to be really aware of both the push and the pull, and when to use tie stitches to avoid pieces from becoming unraveled. This is some of these things we are going to set in software as settings. We are going to use automation to handle, but we should understand where they should be and why before we just let the software handle it. Because what ends up happening if we just use the defaults in our software all the time, when we have an issue or the defaults don't match what we want, we will have a lot harder time figuring out what's going on. Whereas if we start from a knowledge of what we need, we can look for those settings before we get there. We know what we're going to have to look for as far as getting those settings we need, getting those things set up the correct way. In summary here, you have to understand the nature of the embroidery itself. and how it's used to create images. You'll get beyond it. You're starting out with theory. You're starting out with just understanding a little bit more about how embroidery works, how stitch types work. You're understanding with the technical knowledge of embroidery and digitizing. That understanding is the first portion. And these are the kind of questions you're going to ask yourself, certainly. What are the elements of an embroidery design? And what are the variables that control their outcome? If I want more coverage, what do I need to do? Well, you want more structural underlay. Maybe you want more density, but you might want to use underlay to support the structure. Let's say, because we know if we have these stitches on top and they're a little bit too far apart, but we don't want to get too many stitches packed together, well, we can use underlays of different kinds to do some color coverage. Let's say the edges are a little rough. We might use an edge run underlay because it'll hold on to those as it pulls, and it'll give us a little cleaner edge and as well some color coverage. If we understand these things, we know how we can combat some of the issues we might have, or the quality issues that we don't like in our embroidery, things we have to work on. How do those variables control the outcome of these portions? And then what will changing a given variable do to the finished design? If I change the density in this fill, how does it look? If I make the number larger, if I make that spacing larger, what does it look like? What does this particular spacing, let's say I want a 6-point density, pretty open, right? Pretty open. What is that going to look like on my garment? If we don't understand these things, if we don't do things like swatch testing, where we actually make little swatches of fills at different settings and see what do they look like in a certain color combination on a certain material with these different angles. We should test some of these things out because it is the palette of variables from which we will pull when we know what we want. If I'm looking for something, you might say, okay, well, I don't want a fill that shows through the background. You never know when you do. You might want a shadow that you don't want to be complete, and you just want to have a little bit of shading on the side of something, and you don't want a full solid block of color. Knowing how dense or how loose that should be in order to get the amount of thread down that you want, the amount of show through of the garment that you want, is a thing. You'd never know now as you're first starting out or as you're working on one project, what settings might not be valuable or interesting or create a texture that you like or create a look that you like for a future project. So knowing what can change in the variable do to the finished design is huge. And like I said, part of this is really design construction. You're going to say, all right, what should be a fill? What should be a satin? What should be a straight stitch? What should be a different kind of stitch? Maybe there's some specialty stitching, motif stitching, or other kinds of satins or back stitching, or there are other stitch types. But the primary three are always going to be the biggest foundation, especially for things like corporate logo work. It's going to be your constant bread and butter settings, your constant bread and butter, certainly stitch types. But we learn a little bit about design construction, how it's put together, what order things should go in, how we hide our traveling, where do we go to jump back and forth, how do we deal with our trims, how do we deal with density, how do we deal with these things. Design construction is certainly a big part of it. And when you get beyond that, I mean, certainly, when you get beyond that, there'll be aesthetics. The aesthetics of embroidery and digitizing is the next level. First, you learn how to make sure you can get stitches on the garment and have them turn out the way you want. Satin stitches are the width you expect and the height you expect. Borders don't tear things up in the fill. You understand how angles go together, what have you. You understand what is the nature of embroidery, but then you go back and learn what kind of textures can be aesthetically pleasing. How can I create more dimension by layering things together? How can I use the natural shine and shadow that is on a stitch, on individual stitches, on satin stitches, the textures of fills that are either more organic or more irregular, short or long stitches, and how do they look? Are they shinier or duller? What can I do with different threads? These things will get into the aesthetics of embroidery and digitizing. What will thick threads or fuzzy threads do to the look compared to shiny threads or smooth threads? What is thin thread versus thick thread? Can I get smaller details? And that stuff can also get into the design construction phase and the understanding of materials, because we know 6-8 thread is going to give us about 25% less thickness roughly, and will allow us to go about 25% smaller in our smallest satin stitch, in our smallest gaps, provided our material works with it. So once again, holistic, we have to know what the material is going to do as well as all these other things. But the thing is, as we get better at this understanding, as we get more of this kind of information under our belt, we, as the Icelanders say, we understand it under our lower jaw. So it's not just in our heads, it's in execution. We've seen it, we've held it in our hands. You will not be constantly referring to measurements. You'll just kind of know. you'll have a feeling for it. You'll grab a new piece of material and go, all right, it stretches a lot horizontally, not a lot vertically. I'm going to have to watch that. Got to make sure the hooping's right. I've got some grain here, so I'm going to use some underlay so that vertical grain is going to be covered up and won't let the design fall through it. Maybe I'll use a mesh underlay, so there's always a stitch of some angle to hold it up off of that garment that has some texture to it. You'll know the tools and the tricks of the trade, but you'll know it but through experience. You'll know it through understanding how the materials act together. That's just part of it. And I think the thing is, it seems really complicated, but one design with a certain setup that has some of these settings in it will teach you a lot. And then as you develop all these different designs and you run and run and run, you will eventually get to this point where, and this is the analogy I always use. When you first started driving as a kid, if you're somebody who drives, the first time you started driving, you were thinking about the mirror and you were looking at the mirror, you're looking at all the mirrors, they're adjusting it, you're checking it out. You go, okay, I have to stop. I'm about to turn. I need to signal the turn. I'm slowing down. I'm pressing the brake. I'm slowing down. My hands are at 10 and 2. I'm making sure my signal's on. I'm looking behind myself. I'm checking my blind spot. You're doing all this stuff to drive. Now, when you get in the car, you buckle up, you fire it up, and you drive. And your brain has folded all of this stuff down into one task. You know how to do it. Certainly you're paying attention. You still have to be present. You have to know what you're doing to do it. But those experiences are going to fold together. And when you go to change lanes, you're not going to be, okay, I'm signaling, slowing down, looking here, checking the mirror, checking my blind spot, looking back forward, making sure I'm fine, turning the wheel. You're not doing 20 tasks. You are changing lanes. And honestly, you are driving. These things become natural as you practice them, become natural as you experience them. And that includes some of the understanding of settings. You'll have some basic settings you use all the time, and you'll know if I'm having a result that I don't like due to textures. Okay, what can I do to avoid the problems with textures? I can change stitch angle possibly. I can definitely add some underlay that's structural to hold up the top stitching off of the garment. I can check out if my angles are working against or on top of a grain of the material that's causing some show through or some fall. If I've got stretch, I can say, am I hooping it right? Do I have the right stabilizer? If I am, maybe the angle of the stitch type I'm using is working on the weakest angle of the fabric and causing undue stretch. I'm going to change my stitch angle so it doesn't pull on the fabric like that. It doesn't mean you're going to have an encyclopedic knowledge of every hat, of every garment, of every piece of material you ever come across. What it means is when you see a piece of material, you go, all right, I know what happens when it stretches really hard on the 45-degree angle. I'm not going to put all my angles at 45 because if I do that, all those stitch angles are going to pull or push in that angle and cause the weakness of the fabric to be exposed. You'll know that from the get. And so you won't make that mistake to start from. Let's grab a couple of comments before we go into the last section of the kind of knowledge you need. Let's go ahead and take a look at what we've got. So we've got a few comments on here. And I'll say this. First, happy to have you tuning in from Australia. Deneen, happy to have you here. And whenever you get a chance to. Mike says, as far as watching design, screen replay doesn't count. Here's what I say. The slow replay, screen replay, scrubbing through the film strip, whatever it is that plays your design out as if it's running is a very useful tool to see gross errors and problems in sequencing and problems with copy and paste errors. It does not absolve you from needing to watch the design run on actual fabric with actual materials. That stuff is not what you want to do. You don't need to be sitting there watching the replay over and over and over again, never getting on the machine. Eventually, you're going to have to just get out there, take the risk, and run on the machine because those materials are going to act under the physical load and the distortion of embroidery in a way that you have to see to believe. You're not going to see it in the design replay. Should you watch the replay? Absolutely. Critical part of pre-flight. If you haven't seen my video on pre-flight, go check out or search pre-flight on my channel, and I'll talk all about the things you should do before you run a design. Absolutely. So happy to have that. Sally says, night, and going to catch a rest on replay. Hey, folks, you never have to worry about stepping out or catching the replay. If you are watching the replay right now, you are a welcome part of the community, and please comment because somebody will like your comment or say something or answer your question if they can get back to it. I'm happy to have you here, whether you watch live or you watch the replay. I love getting you here live because I like to hear the comments and get to say hi to everybody. But if you're watching on the replay, if you're listening later, you are absolutely part of this community. You are a reciprocator, and I'm happy to have you here. Jenny says, I send out a lot of my digitizing now because I'm so busy. One came back with basic mistakes, no tie-offs, etc. Being able to identify this only comes with experience. If it had been sent to a beginner, they'd have seen it with a poor result. Absolutely. I mean, that's the truth. The experience makes the difference, and having some good designs, what I always call known good designs as a base to understand what's going on. is good. And in fact, I'm not saying my designs are the best. I think I do all right. So why have I at several of my teachings, my classes, given away certain designs or given away multiple designs or given everybody the key to my little stock design site that only has a few sets? Is because most of those designs, I'm pretty confident, have the basic settings in place where they should be, have the distortions done the way they should be done. And I want you to have designs that you can look at and run and work for. So I haven't been putting up new designs on onlystitch.com. I have some prepared that I am going to put up. My wife has been telling me over and over, get some of your old designs up there that you haven't put up. People want them. But if you go to the onlystitch.com, you check those designs out. Why are they there? They're there for you to play with. They're there if you like my unique sense of style. A lot of those are ones that in fact, I believe all the ones that I have up there are ones that I've drawn myself. So I've either drawn them myself or adapted them from historical sources. But the reason why I give those away is absolutely because I want you to have some baseline designs where you can at least look at them and see that. And honestly, if you run one of my designs, you don't see what you want out of them or want to ask questions, you can come to the Takeup on Fridays and hold me to task. But that's one of those things I like to say for sure. But Jenny says, yeah, as a company she's used for several years, guessing they have a trainee. Hey, people always start somewhere. And absolutely, this is one of the reasons I tell people to learn theory before they learn machine operation. Because if you lean too hard on your default settings, you might do something weird to your software, check off a box, or you're playing around with your settings trying to make something work and forget to turn off something and then output a file. If you're not paying attention, you're not doing that pre-flight where you're watching your design run before you put it on the machine, yeah, you might miss things out like you didn't have any trims or any tie-offs. Cindy says, you're a wealth of knowledge. I appreciate you sharing with us. Thank you, Cindy. Happy to have you here. I know, and you did great Takeup. I know this is a topic we've covered before, but I'm always happy to share on this because I think all of us can get back to fundamentals. I know it's a sports thing people always say. They're like, oh, well, they're really good at the fundamentals. And here's what I'm going to say. Knowing the basics, knowing what you need to know, and working on those basics, that's the foundation for everything else. You want to do something crazy and experimental? Let's put it this way. You want to do that cool textured foam stuff like you're seeing from Vitor and you're seeing from Justin, you're seeing from Jeff. You want to work on that cool foam stuff? If you don't down here know how foam works at all and the densities it takes to cut it, or if you don't down here know how to operate your machine and set it up correctly, you're never going to make cool textured foam designs. Because you'll miss it somewhere here because you don't know how foam works and the settings that you need, and you don't know what stitch types to use or what to do with them. And if you can't get the machine to run it at all, you don't have any way to test. You have to build up to that stuff. Now, any one of these can cause you to have problems. Let's say you're very artistic and you know cool things about texture and stuff, but you missed something out in your software settings, and so you don't know how to set it up correctly. That will kneecap your design too. But any one of those things is necessary to see that, to make that cool stuff. You want to make a design. Hey, I talked about gradients this morning because somebody asked me about it. You want to know how to make a gradient. If you don't understand density, you're not going to make a gradient that has a nice density on the garment. And frankly, if you don't understand what density is, trying to set multiple colors together in layers to try and get them to make a gradient from one side to the next of multiple colors. The one I showed was a 7-color gradient. You can't do that without understanding that how the spacing of the threads interacts with each other and how stitch angles work. The basics are necessary. The fundamentals are necessary to experimentation beyond the fundamentals. And being able to control variables is how you get the results you expect. Such a big deal. Such a big deal. And that's how it is. So yeah, it is what we need to do, right? It's what we need to do. We have to understand the basics in order to get through to the rest. And so the last thing, and honestly, I'm not going to get to everything I talked about today. I think what I'm going to do is cover the third type of knowledge. And then we had a little bit about sourcing. I may mention the different sources of experience that we can talk about, but we might actually go into this on a future episode. Like I said, I've had so many brand new digitizers come to me saying, all right, I'm just starting out. What do I need to do? And they want this guide to everything, the one guide to everything. But I think the more important thing than having the one guide to everything, and frankly, though it feels very comfortable to go through a set of exercises that may help you make designs, I think that this is the first thing, knowing what you need to know. And then when you start doing your project designs, now I would still love to do some more sessions, which I probably will do, where I'm like, literally, this is me getting you from nothing to your first design. I think that's a useful thing we can do. But if you don't know what you're supposed to be absorbing, it's almost like the goals at the beginning of a chapter of a textbook. If you don't know what you're supposed to be absorbing, what you're supposed to be looking for, you might not get the fullness of the lesson. You might not get everything you need out of the lesson if you don't know what it is you're looking for. If I just tell you, punch this button here, click this here, put the settings like this, I can teach you how to make the one thing you're looking at, and maybe you'll intuit something out of it. But if I tell you what's important about it and I tell you what you need to know in each one of these segments, and then you watch for that while you're doing a project, while someone's walking you through a design, you have a much higher chance of getting that elemental, essential knowledge that it takes to build on, to make inferences about new experiences. You get all these fundamentals down, and then when you get to a new experience, a new garment, a new type of design you've never seen before, and you want to make something you don't understand, you have a better chance of understanding it. You'll have a better chance of building it out of the building blocks that you know. So that's that. Let's go ahead and go to the last little section that we're going to cover as far as what we have in the kind of types of knowledge you need, right? So what did we have before? We had execution, so it's really materials and equipment. We had theory, which is technical knowledge of embroidery and digitizing. And like I said, it's design and construction. It's really the nature of embroidery and digitizing. Because here's the thing, digitizing is a way of controlling embroidery. It's not really its own thing necessarily. The software part is where we have to take control and learn how to actually draw and what have you. But the nature of embroidery is the nature of digitizing. If I understand that density is talking about how far apart lines of stitching are or courses of stitching are, if I understand what a satin stitch is and how it's put together, if I know what a fill stitch is, if I know what the settings will do to the end result, the digitizing is almost a foregone conclusion. Now it's just about operating tools. And that's the last part of this, right? Software operation and settings. So software operation, people start here when they need to start the other place. They need to start with embroidery and they end up starting at software operation because what they feel like is, I want an embroidery design to put on my machine. I need to find software that makes designs. I need to learn the software. It is critical to learn your software. It is necessary to learn your software. You will not get past your work. You will not get to your goal without learning your software. But if you have all the settings sitting in front of you, but you don't know why you're doing what you're doing, you can either follow someone else's recipe or you can muddle through it and make something and not really understand what's going on. And a lot of the frustration I see from early digitizers is like the density example I said before. It's people saying like, I'm moving the number up in density, but I'm getting less stitches. Because they don't know what density is and how it's measured, and they don't know kind of that theory behind embroidery, and also some of the nomenclature, the jargon, the stuff that we need to know in order to discuss embroidery with each other, and in order to know how software describes what we're seeing, what we're trying to make. If we don't know that stuff about embroidery, we won't be able to really operate the software efficiently. So that's why I tend to put this third. Is it not critical? No, it's absolutely critical. Though I'm going to tell you this. If you have knowledge of operating the machine, so you know what the machines do and what they're capable of, and you are able to test, of course, and you have a knowledge of the theory behind embroidery and how it works and how to describe it, you have those two things, you can take that to just about any software and start making your way. Because you'll know how close together stitches should be to get your coverage, and now you're just looking for a setting. It's going to be density wherever you go because that is the common standard term. Stitch types may not be the case. You may look at a set of stitch types and have column, steel, satin, and used depending on what software interchangeably sometimes, even when it's not technically correct or dictionary definitions. You may have different things called fills or different things called different types of fills. Those names aren't as important as understanding the nature of it. What's important about a fill? What's important about a fill is how far apart the stitches are, how long the individual stitches are, what the minimum stitches, or if there's an edge padding, an area that doesn't have stitches in it toward the edge, and the pattern of fill or stitch penetrations on the fill. Those are the things that define what a fill is, aside from, of course, angle. Angle being the other setting we can actually work on ourselves. That defines the character of the fill. So randomness will make it more organic. More regular patterns makes it look a little more mechanical and smooth. Of course, randomness is rougher. We can talk about the edge quality. We can get jagged edges or feathered edges, depending on your software. But the terminology isn't changing what the stitch is. We're just changing how we address it in the software. So understanding the first two things will enable you to do whatever you need. But there then are things that are beyond that. So certainly software operation and settings, understanding of software, these are the primary questions we're asking ourselves. Where can I find the tools to create the stitch I need? It's not that there aren't other stitches involved. In fact, that's the thing. We're going to talk about specialty tools and automation. Different software may literally have the ability to automatically create different stitches than other software. You will find some softwares like Stitch Artist, for example. Stitch Artist 3 has a faux mirrored edge you can put on that is not in other software. Some softwares will have different ways of echoing out different shapes. They may have different ways of addressing different motifs that don't work the same way. There are some specialty stitches that are only available, or at least specialty collections of stitches, as you know, because individual stitch is always the same stitch, that are different between different pieces of software. However, the basic stitches are going to be there. Our fill is going to be there, our satin is going to be there, our straight stitch is going to be there, and frankly, so are basic motifs generally. So motif stitches, different collections of mostly straight stitches that are placed in different ways, sometimes with satin elements, but groupings of stitches that are repeated in a certain way will be there. Certain kinds of length limited columns or splits in the satin, or automated semi-splits, those are going to be there. So certain things are going to be there, but the top three that we're going to use all the time are satins, our fills, and our straights, or manuals, runnings or manuals. Those are always going to be there no matter what. It's just a nature of the beast kind of thing. We can certainly find tools for cross stitches, tools for motifs, tools for other things, but the basics are always going to be there. And in general, no matter what those stitches are, we certainly want to look at what the capabilities are. Look at your software and say, what are the unique specialty tools? What kind of automation is available to let me do the things I know I need to do automatically and not spend time on them? The kind of automation I think is worthwhile in this case, number one, not auto digitizing. No. Auto digitizing is just going to take away your creative agency. The things that don't take away your creative abilities and agency, that don't rely on the software making choices about what stitches go where, that's good automation. Automated underlay, I use it all the time. Sometimes I will do some manual underlaying when I have something that very specifically needs a kind of underlay that's either hard to create or that I want to control more carefully, surely. But for most things, most satin stitch lettering, most pieces, I'm going to use automated underlay because it's not something that's affecting me creatively. It's not changing the choices I make about the design. It's just there as a support material, and I can set these settings to get the variables correct for how far apart the underlay is and what pattern the underlay should take and what angle it should be in relation to the top stitching. That kind of stuff is there, or it's automated out and works fine. That kind of automation, those kind of specialty tools are useful. Specialty tools like special motifs, special programmatic stitches and stitch types, candle wicking, cut work, motifs, French knots, whatever it is, the different types of stitching, which of course they're all collections of straight stitches in one way or another, but the different ways to generate those specialty tools are useful. Automated cornering and mitering, any place where we get some automation that doesn't require you to draw things yourself, that still doesn't take away from your creative work, that's good stuff. You should still know how to do it manually. If you had to miter a corner manually, you should be able to build that corner miter yourself, whether or not your software does it, because it will help you to understand, especially if it has any sort of variables that are addressable by you, that you want to change those variables. If they are there, you will understand them better if you know how to put that mitering together, if you know how to corner in a certain way, if you know how to build stuff. Plus, automated tools always have limits. And if it has a limit that you're coming up against, or you have to do something that's slightly outside of the limit, you can use the automation where it makes sense. And then where you want to do something that's maybe slightly outside the limit or different, or has a creative choice that is not part of something that can be automated easily, then you step in with your knowledge and draw the shape you need without worrying about the tool. That is only possible for folks who already have the embroidery knowledge ahead of time. If you understand what stitches do, if you understand how to make overlaps, if you understand the interactions between two blocks of stitches that are touching, that you want to stay touching, or ones that you don't, and what you want to do to make them avoid touching, the things that we do to maintain stability, to make satin stitches come out the thickness that we want them, to make our fill stitches look the way we want them and cover the way we want them to, those things we should be able to do ourselves in our minds. We should know how they work, so that when we get to our settings, we can wrangle that automation to do what we want it to do. And when the automation doesn't work out for us in the way we want it to, or it doesn't make sense for what we want to do, we can build whatever we imagine out of the basic stitch types that we have available to us. So these are the basic things. Like I said, where can I find the tools to create the stitch I need? Standard big three are going to be everywhere. Every piece of software is going to have them. And once we know a little bit about specialty tools and automation, we can actually lean on the cool stuff that just our software has in it, the unique stuff our software has. And we can lean on that to make some cool effects and designs beyond the aesthetic stuff that's beyond just getting thread down, describing a shape and making sure that there are stitches inside of it. So where are the tools that we need to create the stitch I need? Where can I find those tools? And then how do I adjust the variables? What do I do to change the density, the angle, and the textures involved in any block of stitching? Where do I change those variables and how do those work? And also, because software acts not only on the individual stitch block, but on the final design, where can I find all the filters for small stitches and long stitches? Where can I find any output settings that I need to know so that I know that I can output correctly to the right stitch type? Things like how many jumps indicate a trim on a DST file. DSTs note jumps by having multiple non-stitching jumps in a row. 3, 5, 7 is usually the groupings that you see. So how many of those jumps will kick the trimmers on my machine? If I already know how my machine works, that's stage one. Then I also know at the end, how does my machine actually take those commands and what can I do in my software to kick those commands off? How do I adjust those variables? How do I adjust density? How do I adjust angle? How do I adjust also the places where we can use settings to our advantage? I should be aware of pull and push compensation and distortion when I start. I personally like to draw in my own compensation for kind of a standard level for the amount that I expect to be on my one garment that I'm working on. But then if I know I'm going to have to just edge it a little bit, let's say my satin stitch is almost where I want it, but it's not quite there, or I have a satin stitch that's not quite as wide as it should be. It's not registering just right on a new garment. I've had something thinner. I put it on something loftier. It was on a shirt. Now it's on a sweatshirt. And I just need a little bit of extra thickness to get that thing to work right. Then I can use things like automated pull compensation. I can set how many points or what percentage of the width of the column that's going to need to be expanded to get me where I need to go in the final piece. How do I adjust the variables and get what I want? I should already know that my satin stitch is getting narrower when it runs. That's not something for the software to know. It's for me to know, but I should know the different ways in which I can change it. I can take my points on my actual rectangle here and drag them out to one side or the other or wherever I need to get the shape I want, knowing it's going to get narrower. And then if I want to add a little bit more, or I find this not exactly enough, or that I'm changing my garment, I can add a percentage or points or something to the design and have it expand a little bit programmatically in the software. I should understand how the variables adjusted. How do I get different textures in my fill? How do I split a satin stitch? And then, of course, the other variables, like how do I deal with the processing of overly small stitches, overly long stitches, machine commands, etc. Those are also part of software knowledge, knowing how to take the design you've created and output it correctly for the machine it's intended to run on. Like Jenny said, she had a design come from a company she used for quite some time, and the trims were all missing, or the not the trims, the ties were missing. The tie-offs, the tie-ons that keep the design from unraveling. We should know where that setting is if we're using those automatically and not drawing them ourselves. The thing is, anything you can make in an automated fashion, you can do slower manually. If you have a manual stitch tool, you can make any stitch type you've ever seen on any software slowly. The specialty tools and automation speed up the process. I can make any stitch type you've ever seen because there is only one stitch in machine embroidery. Manual stitch tool will allow me to make anything that any program has ever made slowly, as long as I understand it's put together. The specialty tools and automation make it quicker, and we should understand them. Should we spend our creative time that is best used making aesthetic embroidery that looks beautiful and runs nicely on drawing individual tie-off stitches? Probably not. We should tell our software that we want to tie whenever there's a jump of a certain length. We should tell our software when to do that. Do we want to spend all of our time doing edge run underlay that's a specific distance away from the edge of our satin stitches? Probably not. Unless there's a really compelling reason to do it in a way that doesn't work in an automated fashion, probably not. We should just use our automatic underlay. It doesn't change our creative output and it helps us do things faster. Also, if we have the opportunity to use a special motif or a special edge or a special type of stitch that is only present in our software, that's something we would otherwise have to draw out manually, yes, why not? We should avail ourselves of the tools that are there, but we should use those tools understanding how embroidery works, not use the tools and smash them onto the embroidery and hope they work. We should understand how they do what they do so that when we use them and we have, or let's say we have issues in using them, we don't quite understand what's going wrong, we will be able to diagnose what's going on and say, all right, we're going to take, once again, what is this? Our holistic view of things. I guess everybody drink. We're going to take the holistic view of things and say, all right, I'm seeing some issues here. I'm seeing some problems with our pull. I'm seeing some registration problems, meaning like outlines aren't lining up. Things are coming apart that are supposed to stay together. I'm going to work on that and say, all right, I'm looking at my embroidery design. I'm looking at my piece. Stabilizer is the proper stabilizer. It feels good in the hoop. We're not seeing any looseness here. Machine is in operation, running well. I'm not running at top speed on material that can't hold up to it. Tensions are good. Bobbin's full, ready to rock. Let's kick the tires, light the fires. My machine is good. Everything is set up for operation. Then I'm going to look at my design and I can say, all right, machine is good. I know it's operating. Known good design runs correctly as well. Now, what can I do as far as choosing what I need to do here? I can look at my design and say, all right, well, I know that we've got these two things that come together. And like I said, one of the things people talk about is the interactions between stitches. So interactions are part of this. We're going to say, all right, well, I'm looking at two satin stitches that are edge to edge. So satin plus satin, people talk about these interaction combinations, and they are at the same angle. So I know that pull is going to make them both get narrower. Well, these two edges are going to pull away from each other. What does that mean? I'm like looking at going, all right, well, if the stability is there, it's not just the fact that there's not enough stabilizer, so it's just crumpling because there's nothing to hold back the thread. We've got the amount of stabilizer that's right. Well, I'm going to have to work on either drawing my edges closer together and having more overlap that way, or I'm going to have to use some pull compensation in my settings, in my software, to increase the amount of overlap so that they don't pull apart under the normal tension that is caused with the pull. When the thread, the individual stitches are under tension, and then the satin stitch gets narrower, they don't pull apart. Or let's say I'm working on other kinds of interactions. I mean, everybody knows the interactions of stitch types: run to run, run to fill, run to satin, fill and fill. The ways that different blocks that are next to each other work on each other. We understand that stuff. But there's also angle and angle. If I have two blocks of stitching interacting at the same angle, well, these two stitches are going to pull apart from each other. If one is at this angle, one's at the other, this one's pulling this direction, but pushing here, this one's pulling out. Now I have these two forces working in different directions as they go together. I'm going to have to understand this stuff. And this one's pushing these directions, it's getting taller. I have to look at how angles interact. Also, let's say I've run this piece first, and then I run this satin on top of it. If we end up where the entire edge of this satin lines up between these two stitches that are here, it pulls them apart. And we might see a little gap or show through here. So maybe I change my bottom stitch angle. So I'm pulling on more than one stitch at the same time, so I get them locking together in a way that doesn't pull apart and make a split. That's angle to angle. That's also layer to layer. So we have to build things in that way. But that's the thing. When I know my machine's running, I can then look at my design. I can look at the nature of the embroidery that's in the design. And then if I understand how my software works, I can look at it and say, well, I have to change a couple inclination lines here. I may have to adjust pull compensation settings here. I'll adjust my density setting on this column because it's getting too tight, too loose, what have you. And I can look at the results on the machine from my first sew out, understand the embroidery, understand all the variables that are coming together. And with that holistic understanding, I can make changes to my design that are meaningful, that will result in embroidery that I wanted. The embroidery I'm envisioning will happen. That's it. That's the way it goes. So how do we get this? I'm just going to very briefly talk about this because this is something we can come back to. But how do we get this understanding of these foundations, of these basics? Well, these are the things I think we need. Embroidery experience, get on a machine. Watch the machine run, watch designs run, use different types of material, especially run on the kinds of material and stabilizer combinations that you intend to run in your final pieces. Embroidery experience. Get out there and run some stuff. If you haven't run some stuff yet, or if you don't have a machine, volunteer. I've done this before, and I know other people have too. Volunteer in a shop and offer to run if they'll teach you. Take a day out of the week, take a shift, and offer to do that for a month. If you haven't ever been on an embroidery machine, but you want to learn embroidery, you're going to get software, do that. Absolutely. Get some embroidery experience any way that you can. It is very useful. It will absolutely inform everything you do thereafter. Design analysis. Get designs that you know run well. Get a sample of them made in some fashion or make it yourself. Measure things in the design, measure things in the stitch out, and then look at how the design's put together. What are the stitch angles that are used? How much overlap is there? How close are borders to the fills that they're on or to other satins that they're on? What kind of push and pull compensation is being used, or at least can you see in operation? How much narrower is the column on the real thing than it was in the design? What sequence did they use? How were the layers put together, and what direction did everything travel in the design? Get a known design that runs well, that you love, analyze the heck out of it and learn from it and steal the settings. And I know it sounds terrible, stealing the settings. It's not theft. Measure it. Measure the density, measure the stitch length, make notes on how the design is put together. Design analysis. Designs that you love, learn how they were built, look at all the stitch types, identify them, look at the stitch angles, look at the sequence, look at the layering, the overlaps, the inset, the underlay, make as many notes as you can, tear them apart, analyze them, and then build your design based on things you learn from that design. Design analysis. Documentation. Anybody who's seen Embroidery software, you guys know I'm with Embroidery. I'm here in the lovely Embroidery Studios. You know that that's big for us. Brian has written an incredible manual, and you'd be shocked. A lot of the manuals are great. If you're in our manual, well, you're going to find that it has a lot of information about digitizing, embroidery, and even the history of the medium to some degree. There's a lot that is more about interpretation and not just button pushing. A lot of documentation is there. And if nothing else, when you're looking for the button you need, actually knowing where it is can be easily achieved by going to the help file in your help menu or going to your actual documentation, the PDF file that came with your software, and reading it. The documentation on your machine, go through it and take a look. There's usually a quick start guide to make sure everything's running correctly. I shouldn't have to tell you folks this, and I probably don't have to tell anybody who's hung through an hour and a half of this, but the truth of the matter is you'd be surprised what's in the official documentation. It's usually quite a lot. And frankly, most of the embroidery documentation I've seen, I may not approach the magnum opus that Brian wrote in our manual, but all the manuals I've seen generally tend to have some digitizing in them as well. They generally tend to have some design interpretation information, some idea of what stitch types to use when, as well as the button pushing. They may have some of that other knowledge encoded in them. They want you to succeed. We all do. Anybody who's working in software wants you to be able to succeed at digitizing. So we're going to try and give you as much as we can of the other side, because we all know you have to know a little bit more about the design construction side before you know what tools to use. Yes, there's a satin stitch tool. I can tell you how to draw the shapes. I can tell you how to draw a Bezier curve if that's what we're using. I can tell you how to draw with a spline, what kind of nodes there are. But if you don't know why you're drawing the shape that's there, or you don't know when a satin stitch is appropriate, you've got a big question unanswered that's going to cripple you when you're making your design. And also, hey, learn what the conventional use is for those design elements, for those stitch types, and then you can expand and use them for other things. You can fill a large area with satins if you want to, but if you don't know how satins work on material, you won't probably be able to balance out all the tensions that they're under. The next thing is experimentation. Not just machine time. This is in the digitizing side. Make a design, run it, change something, run it again. Even you can make little bite-sized pieces or swatch tests. Like I talked about before, little inch squares that have your settings all set together that let you know what fills are going to look like when you run them. But especially get your design, run the design, see what it looks like, make an alteration, run it again, compare the two. Yes, it sounds tedious. It will absolutely get, like I said, below your lower jaw. It will get that experience into your hands, into your body, into your mind quicker than anything else. Run other people's designs, make notes on how they work. Analyze other people's designs, see how they're put together. Make your own designs, run them, and see if your assumptions were correct. Change something to see how it alters the final look. It is a chain of things that, though it takes time, is very valuable. Certainly, the other thing is direct education. Come to me. Come to a class. Go to the Embroidery Nerd. Come to a class. Go to Lisa Shaw. Watch her classes. Watch the classes that we teach you, because what we're trying to do is give you a leg up. But we're not trying to take you out of the realm of experimentation. The test stitch out is everything. Watching designs is everything. We can give you the leg up. We give you the step stool to reach the top shelf, but you're going to have to get the stuff down. You're going to have to take a look at it. I think it is the best thing we can do is to say, all right, here's all the mistakes I made. Here's the things that I didn't know. And here is the basic ground for you to stand on. Here is the foundation for you. Start with these foundations, and then you can experiment. Because here's the thing. When people teach you a fill stitch is like this, the numerical value for full coverage is this. These are rules of thumb, and you can change these things. You can experiment beyond them. They are alterable. The reason why we tell you the smallest safe lettering is 5 millimeters with 40 weight thread isn't because you can never make smaller lettering that with 40 weight thread. I've gone down to 3 mils, but it's very specific, and I had to design exactly for it, and I had to be very careful with my compensations, and I had to use uppercase all block lettering. The thing is, those rules of thumb give you a basic chance of succeeding in a safe way that's not going to wreck a garment necessarily, or that usually will turn out. Learning those things and why they work the way they do lets you push the envelope. If you want to do something awesome and something cool, start by making something basic and getting it done well. Digitize it well. Do awesome normal text drops. You'll get pull comp, you'll get push comp, you'll get coverage, you'll get underlay under your skin. If you can put a satin stitch border on a piece of fill and make it look nice, then you can do a lot of other design work. If you can add straight stitching to it, you can do a little bit of shading. The little bit of shading you do on a small logo will turn into what you can do on a jacket back. It just takes longer and takes a little more concentration. You get the pathing right on an engraving style design or a piece of black work, and later on you can do multicolor shading based on the understanding of that pathing and the understanding of density and the spacing between courses of stitching. The foundations, those essential elements, are the building blocks of everything more complicated that you can create. All right, folks, with that, we're way into bonus time. Everything's going pretty far out. I'm not going to go much further than that, but let's just go ahead and grab a couple more comments, and then we'll be done for the day. Like I said, let some of that absorb. Even I'm saying it to you, I'm thinking about the things that I would like to go back and revisit and work on. So no part of your experience as an embroiderer, as a digitizer, is going to make this a done deal. You're not going to be finished, but that's the thing. The journey is the way, the obstacle is the way, the testing and the teaching and the torturing and the working on these things that we do informs our ability and lets us stretch. That is how it is. We're not finished with this work, but the thing is, we don't want the work to be finished because we love the work and we have something we're doing with it. We're helping people express themselves. We're expressing ourselves. We're exerting our creativity and creating something in the world. We're leaving a legacy of both the material items we create and the people whose lives we touch and the messages they get to send through their apparel, through their embroidery, and through the heirlooms that we put on their walls. So let's work on it that way and think about it. It's a constant process. Don't beat yourself up. Understand that you're going to be working at this and that 20 years isn't enough for me to know it. And it's okay that it's not enough for you to know it. And the funny thing is, you may learn something tomorrow that I don't know today. In your testing, we all have our individual experience we're bringing to this thing. So last couple of comments. Joe Rita says, I said I was done selling embroidery many years ago, but my last picture was seen by one person. Now I have orders for 10, still working on density. And Joe Rita is doing awesome work in a much shorter time than it took for me to get to her level of work, especially in the artistic, the landscape work she does. And like I said, Joe Rita probably knows some things about making landscapes that I don't know because it's not a kind of work I've done. We all come together and make this this community and honestly, this art, this craft, what it is through all of our different approaches. Bevy Jean says, I can relate to my medical background and the fact that people react differently to the same cure, similar to different patterns, different materials. Thank you again for all this knowledge. Thank you for being here, Bevy Jean. Like I said, glad to have everybody here. These comments and your interactions with them are the air we breathe as content creators, and we love to see these kind of comments that you guys are getting something from it. Frank says, thanks, great episode. Thank you, Frank, and thanks for being here. Cindy, thank you. Have a great weekend. You too. Mike says, awesome. Hey, I will take that from Reciprocator 1 all day long. Mike is awesome and does great work and experiments himself, so loves it. Love to hear that. Love that thumbs up. Thank you. Thumbs up to you too. Thank you from Gina. Thank you for being here. And Smiley says, I used to IT and all of this I had to do, so now I need to apply this to embroidery. Thank you. You inspired me to dig in. That's the comment for the day from me. If I inspired anybody to dig into this and work on it programmatically, to work on it in both a logical and an artistic fashion, that's awesome. The thing is, this is controllable. The reason why it doesn't feel controllable is because this stuff is fuzzy. Fabrics stretch. Things are different. Different swatches of fabric might be different. We can have different things come together. And especially because there's all these different variables, it can seem like it can't be controlled at all. But once we understand the structures that are there, we have the best chance we have of controlling them. Though I am going to say, Give yourself a little grace. If there's a little bit of sawtoothing to an edge of a satin stitch, it's not a bad embroidery. View these things from an arm's distance sometimes. Show someone else who doesn't know the stuff like you do to see what they think, and don't pick it apart all the time. Give yourself some space to go, that was cool. That looked cool. That was awesome. So yeah, that's the thing. We really want to get into it that way. And I'll tell you this, Steve says, makes some of us want to start all over. You know what? Here's the thing. Everything that we've learned to this point has something to do with it. And I'll tell you this, there are days where I want to start from square one too, especially when I see some of the work people are doing when they don't come to it with the assumptions I came to it when I first learned. All of us have a chance to learn something today. And I think that's the thing. It's no failure, no result that we don't like is fatal to our ability to do these things until we don't try again. No failure is fatal until we don't try again. If you try again, you're back in it. And also I'll say this, nobody who isn't in the arena with us, who isn't creating, who isn't trying, gets to tell us what it is and what it should be. We're in the arena. We're here to do it. We're putting in the effort. We're doing the work, and we're putting out the risk for someone to see the work that means so much to us. We get to say what it is. Certainly people can judge it and they can like it and they can not like it. That's their prerogative. But the failure is not fatal unless we let it be fatal. And it's not a bad piece unless we want to say it's a bad piece. And frankly, I will say that I've seen embroideries people didn't like that I found inspiration from myself more often than not. I want you to get the results you want to get, but let yourself understand that failures, results that you don't like, are almost always educational and always an option and are going to happen. Give yourself the space to do that work and to trust the process before you start. And like I said, I'll be the patron saint of lost embroiderers. Tell them I said it was okay. You can always lean on the 20 years I've spent in this industry and say that the expert told you it was okay. I don't feel like that expert. I feel like that kid who is sitting next to that digitizing machine, whipping the dust cover off and trying to figure it out. I feel like that kid today the same way I did. Do I feel more confident now? Yes. But there's always a part of me that is that kid, that very first time I ever opened up that machine and flipped on the switch and saw steering back at me the first set of crosshairs I ever used to digitize. I'm always that kid the same way I am the person 20 years experience. All right, folks. Well, with that, I'm going to let that be it. Good refresher. Good to have you out here. And I cannot wait to see you guys again next week.